Welcome everyone to yet another session of TBR Talks. Our present session, the session that we are going to have today, is called The Art of Translation. Personally speaking, translation is something very dear to my heart. And, as a magazine at the Bangalore Review, we try to promote as much translation as possible. Today we have in all of you, in the four of you, we have some of the finest translators from our country. And at TBR, we are really excited to have you all. And we look forward to an extremely nuanced conversation around translation. And we are hoping that you will be speaking freely and speaking your minds. Another note, we are absolutely delighted that it's an all women's panel. So hurrah to that. And, we feel so happy that it's an all women's, such an elite group of women translating. So to begin with, to begin at the very beginning and to set the tone, I've always thought that literary translation is, other than being a sort of intense engagement with a certain text that you as translators choose to, creatively engage with and, pass on to another language. I've also always thought that it's a sort of, act of generosity in many ways. As a translator, I think most translators have a vision beyond that of their own writing. And it's a vision which I think is, for literature as a whole and readers in particular. So I don't know if you agree with me, but on that note, we'll start off. For our viewers, I want to just put down the format that we'll be taking today. So I'll be starting off with individual questions and introducing each one of you, and then we'll open the floor for general discussion. So we'll start off with you, Sukrita ma'am.
Sure.
So just to introduce Sukrita ma'am, Sukrita Paul Kumar is a poet and critic. She was born and brought up in Kenya. She held the prestigious Aruna Asaf Ali Chair at the Delhi University, formerly a fellow of the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. She was an invited poet at the International Writing Program, Iowa, USA, and Hong Kong Baptist University. She has been a recipient of many prestigious fellowships and residencies. Her recent collections of poems, amongst others, are Vanishing Words, Country Drive, Dreamcatcher, Untitled, and Poems Come Home, with Hindustani translations by Gulzar. She is the writer in Context, series co-editor, being published by Routledge, UK. Her co-edited book on the eminent writer Krishna Sopti is the first in this series. Amongst her critical books are Narrating Partition and Conversations on Modernism. Her translations include Nude, poems by Vishal Bhardwaj, and the novel Blind by HarperCollins by Joginder Pal. Many of her poems come out of her experience of working with the homeless, street children, and tsunami victims. Welcome, ma'am. It's delightful to have you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So if I may start off with the first question, could you please, recount some of your journey as a translator for us, especially, moments that, might have been special for you personally as a translator?
I think this is a very exciting topic, not only by hindsight, but even while one takes on the whole idea of translation, as you take it up as an exercise, as you take it up as a commitment, I really don't think it's really, the focus is not on generosity of the spirit. In one sense, you're right, yes, because you're looking at somebody else's work. But at the same time, I think it's once you get into it, you realize that that's one very important way of getting to know use of language. And it's kind of, in a way, a selfish thing also, to start doing translations so that you become so intimate with the language of the other. And you begin to realize that, it's actually a very learning experience. And that is
It
why you
is.
notice very many authors, in the process of writing, when they come across, in the process of reading, when they come across anything, any novel or any poem or anything which they really passionately take to, they want to quickly own that thing. I think one
Yeah,
of the ingredients of commitment to translation, one of the things is, how do you own the other experience really? How do you make it your own? And
right.
in a way, you want to possess it first and foremost,
Yeah, yeah,
And when you are owning it, that is when the process of internalization of that experience happens. It's no longer that of the other. It is actually your own then.
yeah. Becomes part
And
of
then,
your inner journey.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And then I think once we go at that level, then there is also the same kind of an urge as you have, a creative urge to write a poem, for instance, it's the same kind of commitment to sharing then. Then you
Right,
want to, externalize that. And how
right,
do you externalize? You will do it in the language of your choice, right? So
right,
then you pick up your language and you start. Translation means transporting, you're
right,
carrying something from one place to another. And
right.
in that process, obviously, a lot of filtration is happening through your own consciousness, which
Mm.
also means that there is an element of first owning and then interpretation. You're also somewhere interpreting it. You're translating it in your mind as your own, right? From the other to it becoming your own. And in that process, sometimes the original shifts a little. I'm also using Derrida's terminology a little bit. And
Right,
in the process of deconstruction, as it were, in a very simplistic fashion, also, in the process of deconstruction and then reconstruction, a lot happens. So now comes the question of a very basic question you might ask. What about the notion of faithfulness, right?
right.
You know that there is an original, but you're making another original. I would say that you're
Yeah.
making another original.
And
And
that's
that's very,
often, that's something that is often discussed in translation, right? About the faithfulness of,
yes. And I really believe that when you're making another original, that in that process, it's a very tightrope walking kind of a situation.
yeah,
There is a reference point of the so-called original. And yet, if it starts just parroting it, it will be a
mhm,
very banal kind of a
right,
translation.
yeah, yeah,
So
exactly.
therefore, if you're wanting to make it vibrate like in the original, then it has to become another original. And so the notion of
Exactly.
faithfulness has to be combined very beautifully with the beautiful, with
Yeah,
aesthetic. How do you make it beautiful? So that's when we start talking about the poetics of translation, the aesthetics of translation. And of course, if we go on talking, and I would like, if I were to be an academic, then I would need 15 minutes, to talk about, how do you also therefore look at the ethics of translation?
right,
There is also an ethics to it, which
yeah,
also in the original, when after all, even that is a kind of a translation.
Exactly.
Because your experience of when you're writing a poem or a novel or whatever, that's very much in a way your own, but in a very abstract way in your mind. Particularly as a poet, I would say that it's very abstract, something nebulous in your mind.
Yeah.
And
You can't really pinpoint it.
So if you want to try to pinpoint, then that also involves a certain kind of translation. Because you are translating it into words, some abstract thing is becoming somewhat concrete.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So I think that process is what is very exciting. There is a sense of adventure there. And yet you can see that peak which is shining and you have to climb up there. It's dangerous. You might slip. You might sort of want crutches. You might want to, and you use crutches. You do. You're using all kinds of supporting material. You need to research because it is also cultural dialoguing that is happening between two languages.
Absolutely.
One has to hear that conversation between two languages and negotiate that. So I think it's all very exciting. And if I go to my personal experiences, I think particularly because one might say, okay, but one of my major translation projects was translating my father's two novels, Sleepwalkers, which is original Hobro partition novel, and the other one was Nadid, which I translated as Blind. Now, that was a very big challenge because the author being the father, how do you, it's very combative. It's very, very combative. So I had to at some point take a decision to dissociate myself from that relationship.
Right.
And, try to be basically translating as my own stuff, right? So what I was saying earlier. And when you are doing that, it has to be my English, not his English. Because my father was a professor in English. That was a big, bothersome problem,
Yeah.
And
that would
I was fighting
burden on you.
It was huge. So it better not be a father or anybody who's not even your own stuff. If you're translating your own stuff, translated her novel, The River of Fire, you must be in the knowledge of the fact that she cut out 1/3 of the novel. Said, what are the English readers bothered about? They will not be bothered about this cultural specificity. Of course we would be. But she would quarrel and she would say, it's my novel, I'll do what I like with the translation, So that's another problem. And that's what my father started saying. But I don't want to do it in this English, And so I had a problem. I didn't want the translator to get, the author. I didn't want the author to become so involved in my translation. So I had to cut that out and do it as my own isolated private activity, right? And I think that itself was my very personal, unique experience that I had as to how to defy the author, who happened to be my father.
Yeah.
And particularly, when you look at the sophisticated Urdu fiction, and he was doing that. It was very stylistic. There was a certain kind of sophistication in the way he was writing both the novels. There was style, there was tone, specific tone, like all good works actually. Very distinct entities, autonomous. Now, standing obviously on their own legs, these works. So I needed my own legs, I needed my own apparatus to recreate. I would not say recreate. Should I say transcreate? This is terminology that we use. But of course, if it becomes a total departure, then I think it's important. If it becomes a total departure from the original, I think then it's important to write an introduction as to why are you making a departure.
Right.
And it is at this, just one more little thing. It is at this point that we begin to wonder whether the language of translation, should it or can it domesticate the material or foreignize it? I think it has to be somewhere in the middle. You cannot foreignize it completely that it is totally inaccessible to the reader, but you can't even do it because then you are not being faithful to the original.
Faithful, right.
So it's tricky. It's very tricky.
It is. And it becomes very complicated a decision in many ways, I think. Coming back to what you said, especially when you were translating your father's work, it's just a curious question. On one hand, you say you had, problems, but on the other hand, would it in some ways, because you knew your father it's a personal relation, does it somewhere make it easier, rather than translating somebody you don't know at all?
Well, to some extent, yes, perhaps it does help that you can sort of access certain idioms which otherwise may not be very easy to access because you're talking to the author and you know how this particular author may be thinking or may be using it, even if you don't have a conversation, but you understand that author. At least you understand that at least you feel that you understand. However, I think I really believe in the autonomy of the reader. Once you sort of own it and you're reading, you have to submit to the work, isn't it? Even as a reader, even if you don't want to translate that particular work, when you're submitting, and then when you come out of it, out of that total submission, I think when you come out of it, you begin to realize that the meaning, or rather the experience that you are getting out of it, maybe the author didn't get that, and it doesn't matter. Because it's you are in the center by this time, right? Absolutely. And when you are in the center, how you are receiving it, how you are interpreting it, how you are experiencing it, all of it goes into the making of the translation there. Absolutely. Right? Absolutely. So I thoroughly enjoyed that process. The reason I mentioned this relationship is also because there was, in fact, I'm saying that there was a danger of domination of the author, right? Yeah. And so I was trying to actually stay away from it. On the other hand, when I translated Vishal Bhardwaj on his poetry, I was kind of more comfortable because I could fight in a better way, right? I could fight it out. It has to be always between the author and the translator. The relationship can be very combative.
Okay. And how was it translating Vishal Bhardwaj? Such a person himself.
Yeah, it was quite smooth in one sense because he did give me all the advice. Unlike my father, who wasn't initially prepared to do that. But Vishal Bhardwaj was saying, yeah, you go ahead and do it the way you want to. And I would obviously want to do it in my style. So, but one thing I have to make clear, that whether it is Vishal Bhardwaj or it is somebody else, like my father or anybody else, I think what is important is ultimately, and I really I put a lot of value on the editor. Right. To have an editor is actually to have a third competent eye on what that editor may tell you to do or to change or whatever may not be the final thing. But the opinion is important, or the intervention is important. Out of what you have done and what the editor is suggesting, a third reality emerges. Yeah. It's neither this nor that, and you say, okay, but maybe it is this, right? So I think that process I had, and always used Kirti Ramachandran as my editor. Most of the books that I have translated, I've taken the same editor. Why? Because the editor is familiar with my way of working. Right. And I know her interventions are going to be very meaningful to me. Mm-hmm. So we debate a lot, and we come to some conclusion in a way, very happily. We are fighting very happily.
Yeah. But on that note itself, because you are a poet, other than being a translator, all of us who are in the profession of writing, we, do appreciate the role of an editor. It's immense. A good editor can really change,
Marvel.
So, do you think in the process of translation, it is, like you just said, it's very important. But how similar or different is it in translation? I mean, the role of an editor. Do you work in the same way, or do you think there are differences? I mean, when you're working on your own, when an editor works not on a work of translation, vis-a-vis a work of translation.
Yeah, so I feel that, the translation, particularly when you're translating, because also this whole question of faithfulness has to be kept in mind. That also is there. And also readability and the beauty of it is important.
Right.
So if the third eye of a sensitive editor is going to feel that certain word that you are using is a hurdle, it is not facilitating, but it's an obstacle to understanding. Then if there is a pointer, then which is pointed out to you, then the instinct normally is to say, no, but it means this, and no, but, you go on. But if you have faith and trust in the other person's opinion, you begin to realize that maybe you should think again, right? And translation ultimately is a matter of choices, right? So if another choice comes and you reject that choice, then I think it's important to think of the third choice, as I'm saying. And that happens often when the editor is there. Unfortunately, and I'm sad to be saying this, but whether it's a very well-known publisher or a small publisher, usually editing is not happening in the way that it should. Editing is not happening in translation, just as reviewers are not paying attention to translation,
Absolutely.
So that problem is there. And that's why I'm emphasizing on the role of the editor. And I think we need to be, publishing houses, the publishers also to be aware that there is a very big role that an editor has to. Of course, the editor needs to be well up and has to be a strong bilingual.
Absolutely.
Bilinguality is very important, which is true that it's kind of, in a way, diminishing a little because we are becoming more and more monolingual,
Yeah.
So we have to move out.
Which is another whole new problem, absolutely.
Absolutely. So,
ma'am, on that note, would you please read something from one of your translated works?
Yeah, maybe I should read from, I was wondering which one I should read from. And it just occurs to me that I might even sort of want to read from The Blind, from my novel.
Sure.
Translation called Blind, right? Now, in this novel, I need to say this as a fact. Oh my God, I've dropped the... Sorry. So what I feel is that, in this particular novel, my entry point was very difficult. Entering this particular domain of the world of the blind, right?
Right.
In a blind home. So it was very difficult. How do I enter this? Because very complex thoughts have been presented in a very simple language in the original. Okay. Now, how do you acquire that,
Yeah.
So it was a great effort because initially this was being translated by a colleague of mine called Hina Nandrajog. When I looked at that draft, and with her, when I looked at it, we thought we needed to demolish it totally because it didn't seem like the world of the blind,
So you went again and translate
all.
My God.
All over it, we sat down. But which is the same story as that of what the author did to the first draft of the novel. Because when he wrote this novel, and I'm a witness to that, he tore the first draft. Because he said it doesn't look and feel like the story of the blind. And then he went through it with the with eyes closed in one sense, in the experience of it, and then rewrote the novel. And then he came out of the room very excited one day and said, "Oh, it's done." And I think now it's made a point, right? So I needed to do something like that to translate it. And it almost happened like that. The first draft was totally demolished. And so let me just read one little paragraph here. And in fact, in one of this, and this happens later in the novel, it's so beautifully brought out as to how fingers become eyes of the blind man who is making baskets. And whoever he is going to make the basket for, the basket becomes, because the fingers realize how to bring out the personality of that person in the basket. And if I read the whole thing, that is so beautifully done. Because how is that basket going to be meant only for one particular specific person? Because the maker has used his fingers like eyes, So anyway, I'll read the first paragraph itself, right? Sharfu. Each of us has his own way of seeing. Who can tell how the other sees? As for me, I see the whole world within myself. Lofty mountain peaks that pierce my insides, wide rivers in whose eddies I sometimes get trapped. Dashing against the rocks, I smash into pieces, but my banks gather all the pieces from the flowing waters, put them together, and carry me to a safe and secluded Maidan. Within me lies the world of worlds. Many places in this world have been torn and worn by cruel seasons, but somehow I managed to patiently build kacha pakka bridges so that no part of me remains isolated. I arrive wherever I wish to reach the very moment the thought of getting there comes to me. I live in every speck and atom of this universe of mine. No, I'm not making any claim to godhood. The truth is that I was born blind and I lie inside myself quietly. Quietly? No, that's a lie. And it is also a lie that all of my fragments lie scattered. The truth is that all my bridges are broken. I comfort myself in vain. In fact, blind as I am, I'm unable to reach anywhere. Even if I have to reach my mouth from my ears, I fall with a thud on the way.
Wow. That's such a sensorial experience almost. Wonderful. Thank you, ma'am. Rohini, will come to you. Just to introduce Rohini to our viewers, Rohini Chowdhury is an established literary translator and the author of several children's books. Her published writing in Hindi and English covers a wide spectrum of literary genres, including translation, novels, short fiction, comics, and nonfiction. Her primary language as a literary translator are pre-modern and modern Hindi and English. Her translations include Banarasi Das's Ardha Kathanak, regarded as a first autobiography in an Indian language, and the Ramcharitmanas of Tulsidas. She is published by Penguin Random House India, Scholastic India, and Rupa Publications. Rohini is also interested in the preservation of folklore and traditional stories and runs the website longtimego.com. Born and educated in Kolkata, India, Rohini now lives and writes in London, UK. Wonderful to have you here, Rohini. Thanks so much for agreeing to be with us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I want to start off by asking you that, you translate in multiple languages, and your translations include quite a few heavy texts also. So please take us through your journey of translation?
Okay, well, when I first began writing, which was now 22 years ago, it seems like a very long time, I began writing for children. It's a genre I love and I still enjoy. One of my most pleasurable reading experiences, even today, is reading children's literature.
You
So at
began by
that time,
translating for your children,
no,
right?
I began by writing for children,
Okay.
not translation. Translation as a possible literary activity was not on my horizon at all.
So she began
Nowhere.
by writing for her children, right?
Yeah, well, no, well, I was writing for my children for a long time, but about 22 years ago, I decided to write professionally.
Right.
And that's when I went out and got my children's books out there with Puffin and so on and so forth. But translation did not feature on my horizon at all. I didn't even think of it as a possibility. I mean, my basic degrees are economics and business, so I wasn't thinking in that way at all. But we were in the UK at that time. And that, as you know, is a staunchly monolingual world. You just hear English here. Accents, yes, but the language is English. And this was a very sharp contrast to India, where we move, most of us, through several languages. Even in the course of a single conversation, we switch languages. And we do so effortlessly. We do so even without being aware of it most of the time. Now, as my children began to grow up, despite all my efforts to keep them multilingual, there was too much English. There was English in school, there was English all around. And I realized that they were going to grow up much more comfortable in English than in Hindi or Bangla or any Indian language. And at that point, I realized that it was very important to me that they still have access to their cultural heritage, whether they knew the languages or not. And that's when I began to actually start putting into English bits and pieces for them. That's when I started translating stories for them, poems for them. That's when I picked up the Panchatantra, which took a good 20 years to happen, and finally found a home with Puffin in 2017. And along with that, I began to look again at my own heritage more closely, not just children's, but the wider literary heritage. And I went back to reading the Bhakti poets, particularly Surdas. And it was while I was reading Surdas that I had the absolutely good fortune to meet Dr. Rupert Snell, who was then with the School of Oriental Studies. And he is, of course, an acknowledged expert in Braj Bhasha. So I began talking to him about this, and he said, you know what? Put aside Surdas for the moment. Read Banarsi Das. I said, who? He said, Banarsi Das. I'm sending you his book by post now. And I got this amazing book, Dr. Mukund Lat's translation of Banarsi Das's Ardha Kathanak, which had facing page, the original. I read the original and I was blown away by it. I had never read a text that was so exciting in pre-modern Hindi, And I got really excited. I said, the world has to know about this. How come we don't know that such a thing exists? So the next time I was in Delhi, I was talking to Ravi Singh, who was then commissioning editor with Penguin. He's now Speaking Tiger, of course. So I told him about this text and I said, look, Penguin has just entered into translation. Why doesn't Penguin bring this out? And Ravi said, well, in which case, why don't you do it? I said, hey, I'm not an academic. I don't have an MFA and all these degrees. I'm not qualified. He said, look, we don't want academic translators. You know this text, you understand it. You are so excited about it. Do it. So, well, to cut a long story short, I did it. I absolutely loved it. And that was it. There was no looking back after that. And translation became a thing for me. So that's where it all began.
Wonderful. Rohini, I ordered the book Ardha Kathanak, and
thank you.
I've been sort of reading bits and pieces. And for everyone else who doesn't know, it's like she just said, it's written in, it's a text in Braj Bhasha and written in 1641, which she has translated into English. And it's also the first autobiography written in any Indian language. So tell us a little bit of details about, the intricacies of translating that role.
Yes. So as Maitreyee said, it is the first autobiography in an Indian language. And it is the life of Banarsi Das, who was a poet, a merchant, and a Jain spiritual thinker. In this wonderful work, Banarsi tells the story of his life. The remarkable thing is that he had no precedent in literature or tradition that might have either inspired him to do this or been a guide for him. So it was brand new, absolutely new genre, new canvas, new everything. And he did this, he wrote this amazing thing. And the other thing is that, you would think, oh, Jain spiritual thinker, important man in the community, maybe his autobiography will be overlaid with pomposity. Maybe he, you don't expect honesty. At least the cynical in me didn't. But the account of his life is a very, very personal account. It's straightforward, it's open. He examines not only his virtues, but also his faults. He tells us about his failings in love, in business, in everything. And it is done with complete and endearing candor. And this candor makes the Arthakathanak unusual and unique and a very modern text. Even though it was written in 1641, it's far ahead of its time. And he tells this story in the third person in a fast-flowing narrative which recounts the events of his life. And the only time the narrative ever stops is when he pauses to reflect on human existence, And his language is very simple. It's a mixture of Braj Bhasha and Khadi Boli, which by then had started to come into speech. And he has a liberal smattering of Urdu and Persian words as well. But like most pre-modern texts, this is in verse, in 675 stanzas, mainly in the Doha and Chopai meters. So translating the Arthakathanak, and given that it was my first serious translation project, initially, I found it, oh my God, there is so much. How do I bring it all together? I had to keep all these factors that I have mentioned in mind. His tone, his voice, the rhythm of his narration, the poetics, to borrow a word from Sukrita, the verse forms he had used. How do I convey Doha and Chopai in English? How do I get that across? So I spent, and I first translated it into Khadi Boli. And that was a prose translation. And then I translated it into English, and my English translation was finally in free verse. And the whole process took me about 4 years to do, 3.5 to 4. So I spent the first 4 months experimenting. I took the first 30 stanzas and I worked them, and I reworked them, and I reworked them. I tried to do it in prose. I tried rhyming verse. I read Mukund Lad's translation over and over again, trying to see if I would find help or clues there. I didn't. And finally, I settled on free verse. I'm talking about the English one. The Hindi was straight prose. That was a completely different challenge in translation. And the hardest part was to find the right voice and the right tone. Once I had that, the rest became relatively easy. And then, but it still took me a good 2 years to finish this to my satisfaction. And of course, once it was done, I sent it off to Penguin, and then, as Sukrita says, the editor comes in. And I have to say, I have been really fortunate in my editors. We have worked in tandem, we work very well. And one issue with editors, which I've always felt though, is again, an aspect that Sukrita mentioned, is the lack of bilingualism. So all the editors I've had on my translated works did not know the original language. So they actually depended a lot on my interpretation. And sometimes that's made me feel a bit uncertain, saying, hey, you're taking me on faith. What if I'm completely wrong?
Right.
But despite that, in a way, when I look back in hindsight, I feel that perhaps that had a value, that the editor, he or she was completely unaware of the original. So it was in a way a test. Have I got across at all? Because my ultimate audience is someone who is not familiar with the original and is unlikely to be.
Yeah.
But overall, I think my editors did a super job. And I'm very grateful to them because they polished it all up and got all the bugs out. And that was very useful. So, yeah, that was my Ardha Kathanak.
Okay. Rohini, you have another massive work, Ramcharitmanas, from Tulsidas. That's a milestone in your translating career. Tell us a little bit about that, please.
Well, massive is an understatement, is the first thing that I will say. Those of you who are familiar with the Ramcharitmanas will know that it is in Awadhi. It is written in 7 volumes and consists of 12,800 lines, which in English translation is exactly double the number. So it's 12,800 lines of Awadhi verse that I took on to translate, and not straightforward verse. This is Tulsidas, and with all his nuances, all the philosophical underpinnings, the story of Ram, which is in itself such a hugely emotive tale for everybody in India, regardless of where you come from. So yeah, it was the massive was there. And yes, definitely a career highlight, because translating from Hindi, pre-modern Hindi into English, honestly, for me, this was it. The only comparative thing I can think of perhaps is to translate Jayasi's Padmavat, which is also in Awadhi. But I mean, that's another story. So yes, so first it was the enormity of the task that I took on. I did that. I said, yes, I'm going to do this in a moment of enthusiasm. And then I went home and I said, oh my God, what did I just do? Did I commit to the Ramcharitmanas? But so yeah, and then, given its size, given its importance, given its influence on the social and religious landscape of North India, this was daunting in many ways. And it was also something which came with immense responsibility, because this text means so much to so many people that you can't just be casual about it.
Exactly.
You can't be casual about translation at all. But with the Manas, it's a whole new thing.
Yeah.
And then Tulsidas himself. So for me, as it is for most translators, translation is a process of deep engagement with the text, and through the text with the mind of the original writer, the original poet. And to engage with the mind of Tulsidas was a rare privilege. It was amazing because he was a man of deep spiritual insight and a poet of extraordinary talent. I mean, there's nothing that I can say that will be enough. So the
very quickly, Rohini, I want to know what was the reception. Sorry, and you can continue.
The reception of
reception to the translation. I also want to know.
Reception to the translation, well, it was an odd thing because it hit COVID.
Oh.
And so it got buried, completely buried with COVID. Yes, it was a huge pity, but I have to say that despite COVID, and despite the fact that because of COVID, publicity didn't happen, promotion didn't happen, this has sold more than all my other books in 20 years put together. So yeah, it did have a good reception, but I wish, had times been better, I think it would have got more prominence, which COVID kind of took away from it. But what can we say?
I know, absolutely.
But yeah, so this huge thing, it took me 5 years to translate. It took Tulsidas 3 years to compose, but it took me 5 years. I spent the first year only reading, just reading the Manas, rereading it, reading translations, reading other things written about it and all around it. And it was only then that I embarked on the translation. And just like with the Ardha Kathanak, it took me a few months to get the right tone, and get the right voice and get the right style. And once again, I settled on free verse and did it, kind of a line by line thing. And it was a task of complete immersion. For 4 years, I slept, dreamt, ate, talked only Tulsidas. There was nothing else. And I'm sure I was a huge bore to everyone who was around me. But now when I look back, and there were times I thought I was losing my mind. There were times I thought I must have been demented to have taken this on. But now when I look back and I see those volumes that Penguin has produced, I'm like, oh my, I did that. So I feel really good.
But that's probably the only way to go about with such a work, right?
Yeah, you cannot do it casually. You cannot do it half-hearted. It's just not possible.
Would you please read from any one of your texts? Quick little.
Okay, let me read from the Manas. So this is one of my favorite scenes in the Manas. It is from the first canto, Balkand or Childhood. And this is Sita's first encounter with Ram. So they run into each other by accident in King Janak's flower garden, where Ram and Lakshman have gone to admire the garden and collect flowers for their morning worship. And where Sita has also come, along with her Sakhis, to offer worship at the temple of Girija, which her mother has told her to do because it is just before her Swayamvar. Now, Sita hears that the two princes are also in the garden, and she's heard a lot about their beauty and their fame. So she wants to catch a look. She goes with her friends to catch a glimpse of the princess. Seeing Ram, Sita is overcome and she closes her eyes. But one of her companions, who is bolder than the others, describes the two brothers. And this is how this works out. So here we go. Sita, bewildered, was looking all around her. Where have the young princes gone? She worried. Wherever the fawn-eyed Sita turned her glance, quantities of shining white lotuses rained down. Her companions then pointed out, hidden behind some vines, the handsome youths, one dark, the other fair. Seeing his beauty, her eyes filled with longing, and she rejoiced as though she had found her own treasure. With unwavering gaze, she looked upon Raghupati's radiance. Her very eyelids forgot to blink. In the intensity of her love, she lost all sense and awareness of her body, like a chakor gazing at the autumn moon. Through the pathways of her eyes, she took Ram into her heart, then wisely shut the doors of her eyelids. When her companions realized that Sita was overcome by love, they were abashed and could not say a word. At that very moment, the two brothers emerged from the arbor of creepers and vines, like two radiant moons through a curtain of clouds. The two handsome brothers are the very pinnacle of beauty. Their bodies are as bright and splendid as the blue lotus and the golden. Elegant peacock feathers entwined with bunches of flower buds here and there adorn their heads. Upon their foreheads gleam their tilaks and drops of perspiration. Their ears are adorned with beautiful ornaments, with curving eyebrows and curly hair, and eyes as bright as new lotus buds, and handsome chin and nose and cheek, and charming smiles that captivate the heart. The radiance of their faces is such that I cannot describe it. Beholding them puts innumerable gods of love to shame. Jeweled necklaces upon their breasts, conch-like necks, and arms strong and powerful, like the trunk of Kam's young elephant. And the one with the cup of leaves, full of flowers in his left hand. The dark prince, my dear, is utterly enchanting. Slim-waisted as a lion, clad in yellow garments, he is the abode of beauty and grace. Beholding the jewel of the solar dynasty, Sita's companions forgot themselves completely. This was her encounter with Ram.
Thank you so much, Rohini. And that sounded so wonderfully lyrical. That's the thing about our ancient texts, isn't it? And this beautifully ornamental and lyrical, the kind of text you don't see these days, in contemporary writing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We'll go on to Bhashwati now. Just to introduce Bhashwati to our viewers, Bhashwati Ghosh writes and translates fiction and non-fiction. Her first book of fiction is Victory Colony, 1950, published by Yoda Press. Her work of translation from Bengali into English, My Days with Ramkinkar Baij, has been published by Niyogi Books. This work also won her the Charles Wallace Trust Fellowship for Translation in 2009. Bhashwati's writings has appeared in several literary journals, including Literary Shanghai, Hild, Cargo Literary, Lakeview, International Journal of Literature and Arts, Humanities Underground, Parabas, to name a few. So, Bhashwati, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for doing this with us. And I'm fairly acquainted with Bhashwati's work, I remember first reading her translated work of Ramkinkar Baij. And I think that's also when I reached out to her. And it's a fantastic translation, especially for anybody related to the field of art. Ramkinkar Baij is one of the pioneers of Bengal School of Art. The book is very anecdotal. And Bhashwati has kept many of the nuances as Baij sort of speaks in a colloquial language, and she retains that essence in her translation also. She has, of course, also translated poems and other pieces, essays, much of which was already mentioned in her bio. So, Bhashwati, I'd like to start by asking you that you've translated letters, poems, essays, and all of so many of these things from Bangla to English. So, can you tell us a little bit about your journey?
Thank you, Maitreyee. First of all, thanks for having me. And I'm still a little under a hypnotic spell after listening to Sukrita and Rohini. That was just amazing. My translation journey, I think it's been more spontaneous than planned, I would say. I began by translating mostly Tagore. I had a blog, for many years I've had a blog. And I was translating works by Tagore and other Bengali writers like Upendra Kishore, Roy Chowdhury, and Sukumar Rai, and Subodh Ghosh, the short story writer. So at around, I would say 2007, I came across this book called Shilpi Ramkinkar Alapchari. And it was a book that came to me as a gift from the author, not to me, but to my mother. And then it was passed on to me. And I was so fascinated after reading that. You've described the book a little bit and, its anecdotal style. I was so taken in by the personality of Ramkinkar Baij in that book that I just translated a few excerpts on my blog. And at around the same time, there was this call for applications from the Charles Wallace Fellowship. And it somehow got selected for that. And that's how My Days with Ramkinkar Baij came to be. And following that, I've translated a variety of things, as you mentioned, nonfiction, letters. I've also been working, although I would say haltingly, on translating Oronno Lipi, which is a nonfiction work by my grandmother, Omiya Sen. And it's about the refugee rehabilitation project that was undertaken in Dandakaranya by the government of India in 1960s. And this work also is epistolary. She writes it in the form of letters to a beloved. And I still hesitate to slot the works I choose to translate into strict categories, because I've always translated something that I've enjoyed as a reader.
So in that I would agree with Sukrita. It's almost a selfish act, because you've enjoyed reading the work so much that you cannot let it go without sharing it with the wider world. So during this journey, there came a point when the editor of the Parabas online portal, Mr. Samir Bhattacharya, he sent me a very slim book called Amar Bondhu Shakti. It's a book of essays, and it's written. So the book, the title translates literally into "My Friend Shakti," and it's been written by someone called Shomesh Sengupta, who used to be a friend of Shakti Chattopadhyay, the legendary poet. And again, it's written in the form of these anecdotal vignettes about Shakti Chattopadhyay's life and works. So the Parabas editor encouraged me to translate a few of these. And when I did this, just reading these essays, gave me a very different perspective on Shakti Chattopadhyay's poems. Because now I was reading those poems from a very personal, a more deeply contextual kind of perspective. So that, again, kind of got transfused into my translations of poetry when I translated his works. And in one particular essay that I translated from this book, My Friend Shakti, it's called Shakti's Singing. I had the pleasure of translating both the prose part of the essay, as well as lines of Shakti's poems, which are deeply influenced by Tagore's songs. So he had internalized these Rabindra Sangeet particular songs so much that they kind of reflected in his poems effortlessly. It wasn't as if he was consciously borrowing from Tagore, but they had become so ingrained within him that they just came out spontaneously in his poetry. So far that has been my journey. I would say it kind of is interfered. There is interference from my own writing, which is not translation related. I also have a day job. So in between, whenever I can find some time, I continue with the translation work. I've also translated some of my grandmother's short stories. So the journey continues.
Yeah. Bhashati, when you mentioned Shakti Chattopadhyay's these essays which you've translated, and I've read a couple of, I must particularly mention the essay you mentioned, on Shakti Chattopadhyay's singing. It's an absolutely beautiful essay, and if you can visit the Parabas website and take a look at that. It's a very lyrical essay in many ways, and also it gives an insight into Shakti Chattopadhyay, the person, which was, I felt, very unique in a sense, because most people who have read Shakti Chattopadhyay in translation have read either his poetry or essays about him. They have rarely read a personal side of Shakti Chattopadhyay, which I think I mention this because I think this is the marvelous thing about translation. It brings the readers into an intimate internal world of the other writer, of the original work, and sort of beautifully assimilates both the creation and the personality of the original writer too. So Bhashati, since you have sort of translated both contemporary as well as classical works, would you sort of if not a comparison, would you say what the differences or the sort of journey from classical to contemporary has been like?
Yes, so again, I did not think of them as, being classical or contemporary. It has always been something, as the other translators have mentioned, that has caught my attention so much that, I wanted then to be able to spend time with it in another language. So, and I think there is now a lot of appetite and openness for transcreating, quote unquote, classical works. For example, Arvind Krishna Mehrotra's Kabir, for example, or Priya Sarukai Chabra's translation of Gitanjali. They have taken a fresh look at these very traditionally written texts and reinterpreted them, transcreated them in a whole new voice, which is still extremely, readable and very engaging, and still remains faithful, I would say, to the original, but takes a completely different look. So I would say my experience has been kind of similar, because I haven't really translated something really steeped in very classical traditions. Even the works of Tagore that I have chosen to translate, I feel they're very contemporary. They are still very, very relevant in our day, probably more relevant, some of the works. So I think that has probably guided my journey or my motivations in translating. But if I were to translate something that's, even more strictly classical in that sense, then I think I need more training, and I need a little more grounded discipline, as Rohini mentioned, for doing that.
Yeah. Would you read from one of your translations, Bashwati?
Yeah, I'll read from My Days, and this little excerpt, the author and Ramkinkar Bej, they're discussing one of his works, which is Sujata, and it's in the Vishwabharati campus in Shantiniketan. It had been decided that I would visit Kinkorda at 4 in the afternoon, but at 3:30, he sent a message to come a little late so that he could savor his siesta. Otherwise, I am always only too eager to visit him. As usual, he is squatting on the bed. Before him are arranged paraphernalia for a smoke. A steaming cup of tea is yet to arrive. Every now and then, however, indications emerge from the background that the tea may be served soon. Kinkorda looks rather pleased today. He has shaved after a long time and is also wearing a brand new lungi of bright saffron color. The upper half of his body is still clad in that ancient torn vest, though. I am in a dilemma, Kinkorda, I say without any preface. What dilemma, hey? The other day you were talking about movement and stillness in your work, but the division of these two in your Sujata has put me in a bit of a dilemma. How so? I feel in that sculpture, both stillness and movement have become one. Although we do see Sujata walking, her figure is one of complete steadiness. Despite the posture of rising from the earth in a spiral motion like a tree, which is apparently one of movement, the figure's resemblance to a tree is actually suggestive of stability. It might sound a little heavy, but it invokes the idea of vriksha iva stabdha. The focus is steadfast. The one who is being focused upon, Buddha, is also steady. Had one not seen such an integration of destination and journey, it would have been hard to believe. I hear something new from you today. I had never thought of it quite like that. You think you didn't, but the idea is, of course, yours. Your creation makes it evident. And that is why we are able to perceive it like this. The artist's own perspective is what has got us thinking. Kinkorda sits quietly, a little detached. Perhaps he has gone back to those wondrous days of creative immersion, to the Kala Bhavan of yesteryears, to the east-facing clay Buddha in the courtyard, to Sujata, the dark, young, lanky Jaya Appasamy. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much. We'll come to Femida. Femida is, of course, a part of the Bangalore Review team. And she's a wonderful, other than being a wonderful translator, she also has a new book out. We'll be talking about that in a bit, but first to introduce her. Femida Zakir's fiction has appeared online and in print magazines and anthologies like the Indian Quarterly, Out of Print Magazine, Asian Cha, the Bangalore Review, Quarterly Review, Singapore, Quarterly Literary Review, Singapore, Muse India, and elsewhere. A story of hers placed first in the Himal South Asian Short Story Competition 2013, and another was chosen by the National Library Board of Singapore for the 2013 edition of their annual Read Singapore Anthology. Her translation of Malayalam writer B.M. Zuhara's memoirs titled The Dreams of a Mapila Girl was published by Sage Yoda recently. She has also previously translated C.S. Chandrika's short stories, 2 of which were published in Muse India and Indian Literature. Welcome, Femida. Let's get straight away to talking about your translation journey and how it has contributed to your growth as a writer.
Thank you so much, Maitreyee. It's so nice to be sharing space with such accomplished translators. Like, I almost feel like a misfit over here, but it's really good to be here. And yeah, regarding how translation has helped me in my own writing. I first started doing translations by translating C.S. Chandrika's short stories. She sent across a few of her short stories and I started translating them, and she really liked them a lot. We were able to publish a couple of them, not as an anthology or in print form, but online. And that's when I came across this book by B.M. Zora. And what I immediately felt was how it reflected my own hometown and the language and the atmosphere and the landscape. And this was really fresh and inviting for me because till then I had not read this in English. Having that familiarity with what I was reading was so powerful. And as Baswati said, like, I enjoyed it so much. I knew I had to translate it, and I had to. It was a selfish desire inside me that this has to be translated, and I have to bring it out in English. I should be the one bringing it out in English. And I contacted the author, and she very kindly gave me the permission to translate the book, and it was really enjoyable. I spoke with the author, and decided that we would try and retain the flavor of the nuances that she has in her original as much as possible, which meant that we would be using words in Malayalam without italicizing it, so that it's part of the narrative. And we would try as much as possible to let the meanings come in the narrative itself. So that involves some work, because to bring it into the narrative without breaking flow was something that was challenging, but also enjoyable at the end when you're able to, do it successfully and the author also agrees with you. So in that way, it made me think more about the language that I was using in my own writing, also in the short stories I was writing or the articles that I was writing. it made me appreciate and also search for words and sentences and sentence structures that would convey the meaning much more powerfully than I would have otherwise, done. I think translation helped me to get a hang about writing in a more powerful way, kind of. So, yeah, that's how I got into translation and how it has helped me in my writing.
And tell us about your new book, The Dreams of the Mapila Girl, and how it has been translating that.
Yeah. So, in Dreams of the Mapla Girl, which is a memoir of Malayalam writer P.M. Zohra, she talks about growing in a newly independent India, and she belongs.
It's set in the 1950s, right?
Yes, it's set in the 1950s, and this is at the time when there was no electricity in her village. So she talks about how their house was the first one that got electricity and the process that went into it, and how they got a radio, and how that became the talk of the town, and also how and it's basically about women and how they form support systems within their own houses and their own community. And since theirs was a large household, there were a lot of women, like there were maids and there were also mother, grandmother, and all the relatives, the children, and how everyone had there was a supportive ecosystem where everyone kind of gave each other space and also held each other's hands when there was any problem or trouble. Or so it was, in a way it was very different, as someone was telling me that instead of having a lot of strife within, when there are so many women sitting together, it was actually about the support, how you can all be supportive to each other and how you can bring out the best in each other. And Zohra was the youngest child, and she is portrayed as an argumentative child who is always questioning her mother. But she says this is because her mother was someone who was really very busy. She had a large household to run. She had so many children to look after, and she had her father and her husband, and she had to take care of a large household. And Zora's questions as to why did you have me if you're not able to look after me, or you're not looking after me as much as you're looking after my siblings, why am I so dark, or why can't I go and see a movie in the newly opened talkies, the cinema theater, or why can't I learn Kalripai to the ancient martial art? Now all these things were questions her mother was often termed as an argumentative child who was ready to cry. So Zohra portrays all that. She's told that a woman cannot become a lawyer, and your only role in life is to get married and have children. And how she sort of argued for all that and against all those things, and how she managed to find a way out of the restrictions that were imposed. So positivity in the book, in the narration, that it's even when you feel that there are boundaries around you, these boundaries can be pushed to the maximum, and you do not really have to resort to any kind of strife, or it doesn't have to be an aggressive pushing. It can also be done in a peaceful way, and you still can achieve the independence or the freedom that you crave for. Just have a little patience, kind of. Yeah, that's what
Amita, will you please read a little bit from the book, a short excerpt?
Yeah, I'll just read the beginning because it sort of sums up the author's character.
Right.
One evening, I was playing with Achu, the elder brother nearest me in age. Though his name was Asu, I called him Achu. We were racing cars, or rather matchboxes converted by our imaginations into pretend cars. Since both Achu and I were recovering from a fever, we did not have permission to go out and play with the others. And so we were playing in the hall upstairs. Suddenly, I heard the sound of Umma's Mediyadi on the staircase leading from the women's section of the house. In those days, people used wooden footwear indoors. Climbing stairs in a Mediyadi, gripping the peg in the middle with the big toe and the second toe, was a feat in itself. Velipa's Mediyadi, which he wore when he went out, had leather straps. Uppa preferred to wear shoes when he stepped out of the house. Once a year, Chandu Ashari, the family carpenter, made Mediyadi for the whole family. Achu once broke the small Mediyadi made for me by Chandu Ashari, and how I wept. Uma did not normally come upstairs in the evenings. I looked inquiringly at Achu when we heard the sound of her footsteps. Uma is going to Kozhikode tomorrow morning. She knows that you will cry and insist on going with her. That's why she didn't tell you. Even though I knew Achu was trying to provoke me, my eyes started filling with tears. I was 5 years old at that time and in class 1 at school. I missed school frequently because I used to accompany my mother wherever she went. This continued in class 2. At the end of each year, Uppa would visit the school and meet the teacher, and I would be promoted to the next class. This was the usual practice. I closed my brimming eyes and stood there thinking. Achu spoke again. Uma must have come upstairs to pack her clothes for the trip. You'd better go quickly. Don't take my matchboxes. I'll be right back. I called out as I ran to Uma's room. I told you about Uma's trip, so now the matchboxes are mine. I heard Achu shouting after me, but I decided to ignore his words for now.
Thank you, Femita. That's, I was so happy to be able to hear all of you read from your texts. This a session on translation can just sort of go on. And I personally have so many questions to ask you, especially about the process and thought process, but we are a little short on time. And so I'll be very specific and really want to ask you, something, that is, a maybe sort of common question, of sorts. And I especially want to know about, we've all been talking about translations for, in recent times. And I specifically want to know how, is it easier these days to publish a translation, vis-a-vis maybe 10 to 15 years ago? And also, from a translator's perspective, how, as a career choice, how lucrative is it, would you think? I ask this question, mostly from the point of view that a lot of young translators might be listening in, to this conversation. And, what would you have to say to that? Sukrita? You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I've done that. So can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
So,
yes.
So basically, I think I'm not sure if it's very lucrative even today, because some of us who've already been doing it for a very long time, and we have some kind of a rapport with some publishers, we manage to, sell the idea, or they also don't really tease us too much about it. But I think it's difficult for the young to really get into it and think in terms of, earning their bread and butter through this kind of an activity. Even if you were to think of the governmental bodies, translation is not a well-paid activity, right? But of course, I can see that there is greater attention to translation, that there is no doubt about, particularly because of the big awards that have just come to translated novels. So yes, there is attention being given to translation, but it's not lucrative enough yet. I think there has to be a greater activism on that front, in terms of some of us who are a little more established than others, think
Right.
we need to work hard to see that, young people get into it. And also, but one thing that I really want to point out, and that is that, there are two things. One is that one needs to have literary sensibility. If we are talking about literary translation, then one is that. And the second is that you need to be bilingual. And
Right.
that is a danger, a very big danger that is happening thanks to our, the kind of education that we are imparting. Nobody's fault, but the linguistic hierarchy that has come to be. So even if there are 2 or 3 languages that are being taught in schools and colleges, ultimately what happens is that, English on top, then Hindi, then, the third. I mean, this hierarchy is not helpful at all. So a beautiful multilingualism that we talk about, it is more on the street and less in the classroom. And so either it's the translation, the danger is that the translation becomes very stilted, sometimes, because there isn't adequate knowledge of the original language. And sometimes even the author doesn't mind if there are some changes that are happening, only to get into it, so
Right.
that somewhere, English translations get published and so on. So I think some of those things need to go. And probably there is some little movement towards improvement, but it's very little as of now. But
Right.
I see a little bit of a future in that. I do see people, for instance, I just very recently, and I'd like to quote this, I very recently went for one session in Rekhta, where they celebrate Urdu. Now, I could see thousands of people there, and most of the programs were going on in Urdu, Hindustani, and so on. And people were really enjoying it. And I'm not talking about only one kind of people, it was like a mixed lot, very sophisticated, so-called, anglicized lot. And anglicized, some of them were looking pained on the face because they were not, they were not able to understand some of the stuff, I enjoyed that pain. I really loved it. That made me feel that perhaps they would go and learn Urdu. They will go and learn Hindi. And so on the one hand, it is that. But we would want academic and official patronage to that. So hopefully, in future, there would be some. But as of now, the situation is not very good in terms of lack of, bilinguality of a certain kind, strength and lack, not adequate reviews. Reviews also don't happen properly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
even if it does, the name of the translator is right at the bottom.
Exactly.
If it is there at all.
If there is that name. So we have been, I remember, and I would like to acknowledge here, the fact that way back in, I think it was 89 or even earlier than 89, I got more seriously involved in 89. But Katha played a very big role at that time,
Yes.
Geeta Dharmarajan and her organization, Katha. I mean, I know that a lot of activity, I got associated with it for a couple of years.
Yes.
But, and I know that if it had continued to, have that fervor, then similar other bodies may have come up, and today the situation would have been different. But yes, they did play a very big role in terms of recognition of translation as an art, as a skill, as a practice, publication, all the variety of sides and dimensions of it. So there's a lot to talk about that. But I do see young people sometimes, I've just recently taken over as the guest editor for Indian literature in Sahitya Academy. And I noticed that there are young people who are coming to me and saying, would you like, to see my translation of, say, Oriya short story? And I love that. Whether it's Oriya.
That's so encouraging, right?
Yes, very encouraging. So I feel that, you cannot think of it as of now as a full-fledged profession, but as a labor of love and making time for it, especially, that is beginning to happen much more than earlier.
We can keep our fingers crossed on that.
Yes.
Bhashwati, Rohini, I'd like to, take off from where Sukrita just, talked about, the multilinguality, the fact that we are a multilingual country, especially I asked both of you this in spite of both of you being, outside of the country right now. But, a lot of your journey started from this country. And as you both would know, we are a multilingual country in many ways. But like Sukrita just said, that a large part of that multilinguality is going away, today. But a very interesting phenomenon that I hear of is that many publishers and translations in areas other than the literary translations. People are seeking out young students or literary students from small towns, from smaller cities. So what would you think of this trend, and where do you think the fact that multilinguality is on the decline, affect translation as a art in itself? What do you think of it? Do you think that enhances the role of a translator, or do you see that that's sort of you find less and less people who translate? There are two ways of seeing it, right? So
may I answer that?
Yes, please.
This declining multilinguality is, in my opinion, it's a loss to India, to the world, and to everybody who loses a language. I am not sure that I would say that, one way to look at it would be to say, okay, so that probably gives translation a bigger role to play. It becomes more important as it becomes more necessary to reach out to this audience who will otherwise not be able to access these texts at all. That's one part of it. But I think the flip side, and the side that would concern me more, is that with declining multilinguality, there will be a declining number of people who can actually do these translations with any degree of authenticity or integrity. So that's definitely something that I would worry about with this.
There's a question mark.
Yeah. I mean, it remains to be seen.
Bhashwati?
Yeah, just to add to what Rohini said, you mentioned small towns, Maitreyee.
Yeah.
Which is sort of interesting, which I feel kind of points to the fact that it is in these places that young people probably are still more connected to their mother tongues or dialects, or, the what in Bengali we call the Anchalik, the Bhasha of that particular area. So that probably is why there is more interest in seeking out stories from these places.
Yes.
I don't know how well trained these young people are in the target language, for instance, because as we've discussed, this bilingualism means that you should be more or less proficient in both languages, and definitely in the target language, even more than probably the source language, so that you can render it in a beautiful fashion. But if there is institutionalized support, something that Sukrita they pointed to, if there are institutions that set up translation bodies to train young translators who are familiar or who are knowledgeable in their mother tongues or source languages, I think there can be a more structured and a more encouraging way to promote translations. So I think what I have seen in the recently awarded books and novels that have been that have made it to the fore and got a lot of visibility is just the wealth of stories and literary wealth that we have in our Bhasha literature, which we had for so long been kept away from. Because to write in English is one thing, but when a writer writes from within that milieu in his own language, it is an entirely different experience for the reader. So I think it's probably an encouraging sign that these small town stories are being sought now, and we see that reflected even in our films. Even the Hindi films that are coming now, they speak many different Hindis, which I was not at least familiar with. I would only hear one Bombaya kind of uniform Bollywoodized Hindi, But now you hear many different Hindis. So I think it's a positive sign, I would say.
I just have one very quick question before we wind up this session. What would your thoughts, all of your thoughts, be on bad translation versus no translation?
I personally feel that, even if it is bad translation, it should happen. Because there is some kind of an introduction that happens to a piece. And then, of course, it challenges other sensibilities to take it up, and try to retranslate. But at least some introduction to that work happens. So I think translation has to be a must. And I'm very happy to see that in some universities, actually, translation as a paper in literature is being introduced now more and more. And if that continues, that is indirectly going to also impact on the idea that you bring in your language, your bhasha, into the classroom, into an English literature classroom. And I think if that happens, and also Indian literature in translation is prescribed a lot. So that also is a certain kind of training. So there are actually, two different directions we are moving. On the one hand, there is focus on translation. There are awards happening. There are academic small efforts that are also being made. And on the other hand, at the base level, which is very important, these languages are not being taught. And basically, I'm trying to say that there is a hierarchy. And that is why, people want to go for English, go for Hindi. Also has something to do with job situations and all. It's all ultimately connected. But we have to continue with it. That there is no doubt about it.
If I can add to that, there is no perfect translation. Even the best is not perfect. But there are levels and levels of imperfection. And there comes a point where I would say no translation is better than that. Because, there have been so many instances where particularly Western translators translating Indian or Eastern texts, where their translation has actually very little to do with the original. They have changed it so completely. Just the other day, I came across this translation of Vrindavan Das's Dohas. They are Dohas, they are couplets. The first line has been translated well. The second line is pure fiction. Okay. There has been a lot of debate around the translation of Hafiz's poems, where so much has been done, which he never wrote. I think
that sorry to interrupt, Rohini. I think that is a particularly specific problem of poetry also. And I've heard this plenty of times. Would you agree?
It might be. You may be right that it is a specific problem of poetry, because poetry, I think, would be more prone to this problem and to interpretation. And particularly if you get into slightly mystical texts, sometimes there is a huge cultural disconnect and the translation just doesn't happen. But the thing is that I think as a translator, there is a lot of responsibility that goes with this. Yes, we own the text. Yes, we want to make it our own, but we cannot lose sight of the fact that it comes from somewhere else. It belongs to someone else, by someone else, I don't mean the original writer necessarily, but the world in which it is treasured, in which it is cherished. So you can't totally stand stuff on its head. Some leeway, yes, but there is recently, I mean, it's been my experience, and it could be just a little bubble I'm looking at, but I have come across so much of this. And the tragedy is that the translators who've done this are possibly very good poets in themselves. If they would just write what they've written as their own poetry, it would be amazing. But then to put it
It's
under,
a double-edged sword, right?
So you have to be really careful about this, I think.
Sukrita, you wanted to say something?
Yeah. So I just want to put in a couple of things and add to that. Yes, there is a politics to it also, as to what you're translating, how you're sometimes deliberately
Yes.
translated in a, whatever the text may be, it is deliberately concocted to be something else. And we know, I mean, post-colonial entire theoretical is on this. How do you decolonize the whole idea of translation as well, because it was done for a specific purpose, etc. Here now it would be other reasons also, but you want to appropriate some kind of material, you want to popularize it, etc. I feel, and I think Maitreyee, you probably hinted at that at some point, this whole idea of how are you reviewing translations? If you review, there would be some kind of a policing that would be happening then. Are you focusing adequately on if a translated text comes into the market, then are you reading it not totally blinded to the fact that there is an original and somebody has made this effort of doing it? So it's not only giving importance to the translator, but to giving importance to translation. What kind of translation has happened? Has it really served its purpose? So therefore, in case the translator wants to do something new to the original, then normally what happens is you put it into the preface or into the introduction that I am adapting it, or I'm transcreating it in a particular fashion. But if you are not doing that and deliberately carrying it, or out of ignorance or out of incompetence doing it, then at least there should be some kind of a fear of the Lord, fear of the critic.
Which is missing.
It's totally missing. No critiquing happens. No critiquing of translation happens. So I don't want to blow any trumpet here, but I do want to say we are trying very hard to bring in this series called Writer in Context, where we are focusing on authors and we are saying, okay, you need to not only translate literature, but also see from what context is the writer coming in translation into English. So that is one way of, trying to repair a little bit, but I think lots of more effort is required. And thank you for doing this session, for instance. This is an effort. Thank you much.
Thank you, Sukrita. Thank you, Rohini. Thank you, Bhashuti, Femida. It's been such a pleasure, discussing all of this. And like Sukrita, summed it up sort of so well, there must be so much more effort that must go into this at individual levels, at levels, whether on an institutional level or any other level, wherever any of us are associated, to not only promote the cause of translation, promote the art of translation, but also, take on this very responsible task, of being able to balance out, between creating something new in a new language, giving the voice of the original a newness, but at the same time retaining a flavor of what was. And doing that responsibility is, I suppose, the job of all of us who work in the realm of translation. Thank you so much for this session. I've had a wonderful time. I hope you did too. Thanks to our viewers. I hope we can come back again with another wonderful session. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining.